May 17, 1943, Camp Clinton, Mississippi, 9:47 p.m. The knife touched porcelain with a sound that shouldn't have existed in war. Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, commander of a defeated army, architect of the final stand in Tunisia, bearer of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, sat frozen before a plate that contained more protein than his soldiers had seen in a month. The steak was perhaps 14 ounces, medium rare, still steaming, fat glistening at the edges like liquid gold under the bare bulb of the modest dining room. His hand trembled, not from hunger, from rage, from disbelief, from the sudden sickening comprehension that everything, every speech, every promise, every reason they had given for why Germany must fight was a lie written in meat. Behind him, the American captain stood with studied casualness, hands clasped behind his back, waiting. The wine bottle on the table was Californian red. The cigar box beside it bore a label from Tampa. Simple things, abundant things. Things that existed in a world where enemies ate like princes while your own sons died with pockets full of sawdust bread. Von Arnim's jaw worked silently. His dress uniform, clean, pressed, returned to him with almost insulting courtesy, felt like a costume now. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the peculiar brittleness of a man watching his universe collapse into incoherence. You must be an incredibly rich country if you can afford to treat your enemies so lavishly. The words hung in the humid Mississippi air like an epitaph for the Third Reich. What von Arnim couldn't know, what none of the 371,683 German and Italian prisoners being processed through American camps that spring could comprehend, was that the steak wasn't lavish. It was Tuesday. The abundance wasn't excess. It was normal. And that normality would prove more devastating to Nazi ideology than any bomb ever dropped on Berlin. This is the story of a psychological earthquake delivered through cutlery. They had been told America was dying. For 12 years, the machinery of Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry had constructed an alternate America in the German imagination, a mongrel nation, racially contaminated, spiritually bankrupt, industrially exhausted by the decadence of capitalism. The Depression had proven it. Americans stood in breadlines, desperate, defeated, while the Aryan workers of Germany marched in prosperity under the Führer's wise guidance. The message was refined, repeated, reinforced through every channel, radio broadcasts crackling into kitchen radios at breakfast, newsreels flickering before feature films, posters plastered on every street corner, textbooks rewritten to encode it in the malleable minds of children. America was the Jewish Bolshevik plutocracy, a contradiction that made sense only through the lens of racial mysticism. Its soldiers were soft city boys who crumbled at the first shot. Its industry produced only cheap baubles for frivolous consumers. Its military ran on borrowed time and British courage. Hans-Jürgen von Arnim had never quite believed all of it. Career officers rarely did. Born in 1889 to Prussian military aristocracy, commissioned into the 4th Foot Guards in 1908, wounded at Namur in 1914, he belonged to the caste that predated Hitler's revolution. He had served through the Great War, through the humiliation of Versailles, through the chaos of Weimar. He knew what real American industrial capacity had meant in 1918. The endless convoys, the fresh divisions, the abundance that had simply outlasted German discipline. But even von Arnim, with his professional skepticism, had absorbed the essential narrative. America was hesitant, divided, soft. Germany, lean and hungry and disciplined, was harder. In total war, hardness won. That certainty had carried him through his appointment to command the 5th Panzer Army in December 1942, through the desperate battles in Tunisia as Rommel's Afrika Korps withered under Allied pressure from east and west. It had sustained him through the final siege at Cap Bon, when 250,000 Axis soldiers found themselves compressed into a shrinking pocket with the Mediterranean at their backs and 3 Allied armies tightening the noose. On May 12, 1943, von Arnim signed the surrender document. The next day, British forces took him into custody. By May 15th, he was on a transport plane crossing the Atlantic, a journey that took less than 20 hours, but spanned the distance between two civilizations. He expected a cage. He received a bedroom. First contact, the sensory assault. The flight itself had been the first disruption of expectations. The C-47 transport was clean, not merely functional, clean. The seats were intact. The windows were clear. Nobody had painted patriotic slogans on the fuselage interior. The crew treated him with professional distance, not friendly, but not cruel. They offered him coffee from a thermos, real coffee. Not ersatz made from acorns or chicory, but coffee that smelled like coffee, that tasted like the pre-war world. Von Arnim had refused it. Pride, perhaps, or fear that accepting it would mean accepting something larger. The landing at Camp Clinton, Mississippi came at dusk on May 16th. Von Arnim descended the aircraft steps onto American soil, expecting, what? Guard towers? Barbed wire? The sullen hostility of men guarding their enemies. The air hit him first. Thick, warm, heavy with moisture and the smell of fresh-cut grass. Not the cordite and diesel stench of Tunisia, not the dust. Just grass, impossibly green, stretching across parade grounds that looked like someone actually cared about their appearance. The camp commandant, Colonel John Marsh, met him with a salute. Not a forced gesture of mockery, but a crisp, professional acknowledgement of rank. Marsh was perhaps 50, with the weathered face of a man who'd done time in the peacetime army when nobody cared, and budgets were thin. He spoke decent German, not fluent, but functional. General von Arnim, welcome to Camp Clinton. I trust your journey was acceptable? Welcome. The word landed wrong. This was a prison camp, wasn't it? The highest-ranking German officer captured in the war thus far shouldn't be welcomed. He should be interrogated, humiliated, paraded before cameras as proof of American victory. Instead, your quarters are prepared. You'll find them adequate. We've assigned you an orderly from among the other prisoners. You may select your own if you prefer. Dinner will be served at 2,000 hours. The camp adjutant will brief you on regulations tomorrow morning. Von Arnim followed in silence, his mind already cataloging contradictions. The administrative buildings were wooden, temporary-looking, but freshly painted. Electric lights, not generators running on ration fuel, but steady grid power as if electricity were infinite. Vehicles, jeeps, trucks, sedans, parked casually as if gasoline weren't a strategic resource to be hoarded and measured. His quarters occupied a small bungalow at the edge of the officer's compound. Inside, a bed with a real mattress, not a cot. A writing desk with paper and pens already supplied. A bookshelf with English-language novels and German-language newspapers. American newspapers printed in German for immigrant communities, now redirected to prison camps. A private bathroom with running water, hot and cold taps, both functional. The orderly assigned to him was Unteroffizier Klaus Weber, a veteran of the Africa Corps who'd been captured 2 weeks earlier at Tunis. Weber stood at attention, still adjusting to this strange captivity where the rules seemed inverted. The Americans, Weber said carefully. They are. Not what we were told, Herr General. Von Arnim said nothing. He dismissed Weber and sat on the bed, testing its firmness. Outside his window he could hear voices, German voices, talking in relaxed tones, even laughing. In a prison camp, laughing. He did not sleep well that night, not from discomfort, from its opposite. The dinner that changed everything. The dining room was modest. 8 tables, each seating 4, simple wooden chairs. White tablecloths, not elegant but clean, pressed. The other officers present were a mix of captured Germans and Italians, most of them colonels and majors. They stood when von Arnim entered, a reflex of military hierarchy that the Americans apparently hadn't bothered to suppress. Colonel Marsh gestured to a table by the window. Please, General, I thought you might prefer to dine with just a few others tonight. Tomorrow you'll meet the full officer complement. At the table sat an Italian brigadier general, Giovanni Messa's former chief of staff, and a Luftwaffe colonel who'd commanded a flak battalion. Both men had the glazed look of men in shock. Von Arnim recognized it because he felt it settling into his own bones. The meal arrived on actual plates, not mess tins. Plates, green beans, buttered, mashed potatoes, fluffy, with a depression in the center pooling with more butter, a dinner roll, white, soft, still warm from the oven, and the steak. Von Arnim stared at it. His last meal in Tunisia had been a thin soup with questionable meat, mule probably, and bread so hard it needed to be soaked before eating. His soldiers' last rations had been a quarter-pound of bread per man and whatever they could scavenge. The Tunisian civilians were starving. Children had gathered outside the German lines, skeletal, begging. And here, this. "The meat," he said carefully to Colonel Marsh. "This is regulation?" Marsh looked puzzled. "Regulation? I suppose so, yes. Geneva Convention standards." "Your prisoners of war receive the same rations as our troops in garrison. Is there a problem?" "The same rations. Not scraps. Not punishment rations. Not starvation diets. The same as American soldiers ate, as if feeding an enemy army of hundreds of thousands the same quality as your own men was. Affordable. Logical. Normal." Von Arnim cut a piece of the steak. Medium rare he'd requested, and medium rare it was. The texture was perfect. Tender, but with resistance. The flavor was clean, corn-fed, rich. He chewed slowly, his mind performing calculations that didn't add up. Germany was starving, not metaphorically, actually starving. The rationing that had begun in 1939 had tightened year by year. By 1943, the official ration for German civilians was 2,078 calories per day, barely subsistence level. In reality, with supply disruptions and the black market, most people got far less. Meat was a memory. Butter was gold. Coffee was a fairy tale. And America, which Germany was defeating, which was supposedly on the brink of collapse, which couldn't sustain a war effort, was feeding its prisoners steak. "You see our difficulty, Herr General," the Italian general said quietly in German. His name was Ravelli. He'd been captured at the same time. "How do we explain this?" The Luftwaffe colonel laughed, a strange, strained sound. "We can't. That's the point. We were told they were the weak ones." After dinner, Colonel Marsh offered cigars. Cuban cigars, pre-war stock, but still. And wine. California wine. Not exceptional, but real wine. Abundant enough to offer casually to captured enemies. Von Arnim accepted both. Not from pleasure. From a kind of anthropological necessity, as if sampling these things would help him understand the civilization that produced them. Later, alone in his bungalow, he composed the first in what would become a series of letters to his wife, Antonie. The Americans allowed prisoners to write home, one letter per week, censored but reliable. It would be months before these letters reached Germany through Red Cross channels, but von Arnim wrote anyway, trying to process what he was experiencing. "My dearest Tony," he began, "I am in America now. I know you will worry. So let me assure you first that I am well. More than well. I struggle for words. The Americans treat us with a courtesy that borders on absurdity. Today I was served a meal that you have not seen since before the war. The camp is not a prison in any sense we would recognize. It is more like a military resort." He paused, pen hovering over paper. Resort. The word looked obscene, written in his careful script, but accurate. "I begin to understand," he continued, "why we lost Africa. Not because our soldiers lacked courage or our tactics were flawed, but because we were fighting an enemy we never understood. They have resources beyond calculation. And more terrifying, they don't even realize it's extraordinary." He didn't send that paragraph. Too close to defeatism. Too close to truth. Within a week, von Arnim's psychological adjustment process accelerated as the routines of camp life became clear, and nothing clarified the gulf between German propaganda and American reality more than the commissary, what the Americans called the PX, post-exchange. It was a converted warehouse at the center of the camp. Inside, shelves, stocked shelves, Coca-Cola and bottles, 5 cents each. Hershey's chocolate bars arranged in brown-wrapped pyramids, Lucky Strike cigarettes, Camel, Chesterfield, brands the prisoners recognized from captured American supplies in Africa, but had assumed were luxuries hoarded for officers. Here they were casual purchases for privates with pocket change. Every prisoner received 80 cents per day for work assignments, farm labor mostly, sometimes maintenance jobs on the camp itself. The Geneva Convention mandated it. 80 cents translated to a chocolate bar and a Coke with change left over. To a carton of cigarettes every 4 days. To disposable abundance. Von Arnim watched from a distance as German privates, men who'd been on half rations for months, lined up to buy candy. Not hoarding it, not treating it like precious contraband. Buying it, eating it, buying more the next day. The Italian General Ravelli materialized at his elbow. "I have been asking questions," he said quietly. "The guards think I'm curious about American culture. I'm trying to understand the economics. And the chocolate is manufactured by a company called Hershey. They produce 3 million pounds of chocolate per week. Per week, General. Not for the military, for civilian consumption. The military gets its own allocation on top of that." Von Arnim felt something cold settle in his chest. 3 million pounds. Germany's entire annual chocolate production in 1942 was approximately 8 million pounds, Ravelli continued. For the whole year, for the entire nation, one American company produces half that in a month. The numbers were violence of a different kind, abstract violence, the violence of capacity gaps so wide they rendered military courage irrelevant. Ice cream and cognitive dissonance. The prisoner camps across America had different characteristics depending on their location and the composition of their inmates, but certain patterns emerged that documented the collision between German expectations and American normalcy. At Camp Aliceville, Alabama, which housed over 6,000 German prisoners by late 1943, the Americans built a soccer field. Not a rough patch of dirt, but an actual field with goals, marked lines, and spectator seating for 2,000. The prisoners organized tournaments. They sewed their own uniforms from spare materials, created team insignias, elected captains. Thousands attended matches, cheering their comrades under the watchful but indifferent eyes of American guards, who seemed bemused by the enthusiasm but didn't interfere. At Camp Como, Mississippi, prisoners formed a 50-piece orchestra. They built their own instruments from Red Cross supplies and scrap materials. They performed Beethoven, Brahms, Wagner. The Americans provided a performance hall. At Camp Hearn, Texas, they created an Olympic Games, athletic competitions with javelin throws made from broomsticks, high jumps, sprints, football matches. They awarded medals, handcrafted from tin cans and leather, with the same ceremony as the Berlin Olympics they'd celebrated 7 years earlier. But nothing symbolized the bewildering gap quite like ice cream. Ice cream was rationed in Germany. Not scarce, non-existent for ordinary citizens. It required milk, sugar, eggs, refrigeration, and industrial capacity, all strategic resources. The idea that you would divert such resources to frozen desserts while fighting a total war was insane. Yet every American mess hall had an ice cream machine. The prisoners discovered this within days. Vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, flavors selected based on preference, not availability, served after lunch, not as a rare treat, as routine. Oberst Werner Schultz, the Luftwaffe colonel who dined with von Arnim that first night, had been shot down over Tunisia in April. Before captivity, his squadron had been reduced to quarter rations because supply lines were collapsing. His pilots flew missions on empty stomachs, their concentration wavering from hunger. 2 men had crashed not from enemy fire, but from simple exhaustion and malnutrition. Now Schultz stood in a Mississippi mess hall, holding a bowl of vanilla ice cream, melting in the humid air, and felt something break inside him. "We can't win," he said to von Arnim one evening. They'd taken to walking the perimeter of the officers' compound after dinner, a habit both men had developed in their pre-war careers. "We were never going to win. The mathematics don't work." Von Arnim knew what he meant, but said nothing. Schultz continued, "I've been watching the trucks. They arrive every morning. Supply trucks from the depot in Jackson. Food, materials, fuel. They're not military convoys. They're civilian contractors, just delivering goods like it's peacetime. There's no shortage, no rationing, no desperation. They're fighting a war on 3 continents and still producing enough surplus to give us ice cream." "Perhaps it's propaganda," von Arnim suggested without conviction. "They could be staging abundance to demoralize us." Schultz shook his head. "I thought that too. But the guards don't know we're watching. They're not performing. This is normal for them. They complain about the heat and the boredom, but never about shortages. They trade cigarettes like currency. Because they have so many, they're meaningless. Letters from home, the contrasting reality. By late summer 1943, letters began arriving from Germany through Red Cross channels. The censors blacked out sensitive information, but enough remained to paint a picture of life in the Reich that contrasted savagely with life in American captivity. Von Arnim's wife, Antony, wrote carefully, knowing her words would be read by enemy eyes, but the subtext was clear. The children are well, though growing so thin. The ration coupons stretch further when we combine efforts with the neighbors. We have become experts at making do. Remember how I used to worry about your weight? Such concerns seem frivolous now. Ernst asks about you constantly. He is proud his father is a general. But I see the hunger in his eyes. Not metaphorical hunger, Hans. The real kind." Another letter. This one from a major whose family lived in Berlin. "The air raids continue. We spend more nights in the cellar than in our beds. The children don't remember what sleep feels like without the sound of sirens. My wife writes that food is adequate, but I know what that means. The neighbor's son collapsed from malnutrition last week. He was 13. A corporal from Hamburg received a letter describing the firestorm. His entire neighborhood gone. His mother survived. His 2 sisters hadn't. The corporal read the letter in silence, folded it carefully, and then walked to the commissary and bought a Coca-Cola. He sat on a bench in the Mississippi sunshine and drank it slowly while tears ran down his face. The psychological dissonance was fracturing men. Their families were starving under bombing raids while they ate steak and played sports. The guilt was corrosive. But so was the growing realization that the starvation at home wasn't necessary. It was a symptom of a regime that had built an economy on conquest because it couldn't sustain abundance any other way. Germany was hungry because it had always been hungry. The prosperity of the 1930s had been borrowed, stolen from Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, France. Without constant expansion, without the plunder of occupied territories, the Reich couldn't feed its own people. America was abundant because abundance was its default state. That realization was more devastating than any battlefield defeat. The conversations that couldn't happen. Von Arnim spent increasing amounts of time in his bungalow writing, not official reports. Those went through proper military channels, sanitized and careful. But personal journals, letters never sent, attempts to process an experience that defied his conceptual categories. In one entry dated August 3, 1943, he wrote, "Today I witnessed a truck delivering vegetables to the camp kitchen. Fresh vegetables, tomatoes, lettuce, corn, beans. The quantity would have fed my entire staff in Tunisia for a week. It was one delivery. They arrive every 2 days. The driver was a Negro, what they call colored here. He was whistling as he unloaded crates." Whistling. In Germany, this man would be considered subhuman by Reich ideology. Here he drives a truck full of fresh produce, earns wages, and whistles at his work. The contradiction is total. He paused, then added, "I begin to suspect that we were not fighting a war. We were performing a suicide dressed in military rhetoric. The ideological certainty that sustained us was not truth, but a substitute for truth. Necessary, because reality was unacceptable." These were not thoughts a German general could speak aloud in 1943, even in captivity. The other officers watched each other, uncertain who might inform, who might preserve ideological purity, even in defeat. There were still true believers in the camp, men who insisted this was temporary, that the Führer had secret weapons, that Germany would rally and triumph. But their numbers dwindled with each passing month, worn down by the relentless normality of American abundance. The secret weapons that weren't in September, news reached the camp, fragments at first, then fuller details of Allied progress, Sicily invaded, Italy negotiating surrender, the Eastern Front collapsing backward. The true believers clung to rumors of Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, secret technology that would reverse German fortunes. Jet aircraft, rockets, supertanks. Von Arnim, privy to actual intelligence through his pre-capture position, knew better. Yes, German engineering had produced remarkable innovations. The Me-262 jet fighter was real. The V-2 rocket was real. But innovations meant nothing without the industrial capacity to mass produce them. Germany could build prototypes. America could build thousands. A single example crystallized it. The Americans were producing 16,000 aircraft per month by mid-1943. Germany's peak production was 3,500 per month. The numerical advantage was 4.5 to 1. And American aircraft were improving. The P-51 Mustang, the B-29 Superfortress, while German production quality declined as skilled workers were conscripted and replaced with slaves and prisoners. Even if every German innovation was superior, and some were, the quantity gap was insurmountable. Von Arnim understood this. So did most of the professional officers. But understanding didn't make it easier to accept. They'd been raised on stories of German discipline triumphing through qualitative superiority. A single German soldier was worth 3 of the enemy. Superior tactics compensated for inferior numbers. Will and belief could overcome material disadvantage. All lies. Useful lies that motivated men to fight beyond reason, but lies nonetheless. The steak on his plate that first night had been the first crack in the edifice. Every subsequent day added more cracks. The structure of meaning that had organized his entire adult life was collapsing in slow motion, and he was conscious enough to witness every moment of its disintegration. By late 1943, a peculiar statistic emerged from American POW camp records, noted first by medical officers conducting routine health inspections, then documented more formally by the War Department. German prisoners were gaining weight, not just recovering from the malnutrition of the Africa campaign, that was expected, but actually exceeding their pre-war healthy weights. The average prisoner gained between 15 and 20 pounds during their first 6 months of captivity. It became a dark joke among the inmates. The Americans are fattening us for something. But the reality was simpler and more disturbing. For the first time in years, German soldiers were eating adequate calories with nutritional balance. The American ration provided 3,500 calories per day, high by military standards, but standard for American soldiers engaged in physical labor. Prisoners working on farms or in camp maintenance consumed those calories and converted them to muscle mass and fat reserves that most hadn't carried since 1941. Von Arnim weighed 168 pounds when captured. By October 1943, he weighed 183. His uniforms had to be let out. His face, gaunt from the Tunisia campaign, filled in. His orderly Weber joked that the general looked more like a peacetime aristocrat than a warrior. The joke landed with uncomfortable precision. Von Arnim did feel like a peacetime aristocrat, a role he'd been trained for, born into, but which had been rendered obsolete by ideology and war. The America that was feeding him back to health was simultaneously destroying the world that had produced him. Camp Clinton developed its own ecosystem, a strange hybrid of military discipline and enforced leisure. The prisoners maintained rank structures, saluted superior officers, conducted themselves according to military code. But the content of their days resembled a peculiar peacetime garrison existence that no actual garrison had ever achieved. Morning, formation count, inspection, breakfast, eggs, sausage, toast, coffee. Midday, work assignments for enlisted men and junior officers. Von Arnim, as a colonel general, was exempt. He spent mornings reading American newspapers, mostly tracking the war's progress through enemy eyes. The reports were remarkably candid. American censorship focused on operational security, not morale maintenance. They published casualty figures. admitted setbacks, debated strategy publicly. The transparency was jarring. German newspapers had been propaganda instruments for so long that von Arnim had forgotten journalism could theoretically function differently. Afternoon, prisoners organized classes, languages, mathematics, history, philosophy. A former university professor, now a Wehrmacht captain, taught a course on Kant. The irony was exquisite, discussing Enlightenment philosophy in captivity, while the regime that claimed to embody German greatness burned books and murdered intellectuals. Evening, recreation, football matches, theatrical productions, concerts. The prisoners built a theater at Camp Aliceville that seated 500. They performed German classics, Goethe, Schiller, but also wrote original plays processing their experience. One such play, written by a captured lieutenant and performed in December 1943, featured a German soldier arriving in America, expecting barbarism and finding comfort. The play's final line, "We were not defeated by their weapons. We were defeated by their wealth. And wealth cannot be conquered, only joined or rejected." The applause was uncertain. Some prisoners still resisted the implications. The Christmas that wasn't, December 1943. Von Arnim's first Christmas in captivity. The Americans decorated the camp, not elaborately, just pine boughs, a few strings of lights, a Christmas tree in the mess hall. The prisoners were allowed to conduct religious services. A Lutheran chaplain from the American Army, himself of German descent, led a service in German that von Arnim attended more from habit than conviction. The chaplain's sermon carefully avoided politics, but couldn't avoid context. The Christ child was born in captivity in a sense. Born in a land occupied by Rome, his people subjugated, his future uncertain. Yet the message was hope. Not hope for political liberation, but hope for spiritual transformation. Von Arnim heard the subtext, "You are captive. Your nation is losing. Your ideology is failing. But you are still human, still capable of redemption, still more than the system that produced you." The Christmas meal was turkey. Actual turkey, roasted, with stuffing and cranberry sauce and sweet potatoes and pie, pumpkin pie, a peculiarly American confection that several prisoners tried skeptically and then accepted with resignation. Von Arnim thought about his family in Prussia, Antonia and the children celebrating Christmas with rationed bread and whatever meager supplement she could barter for. His youngest son, Ernst, was 11, old enough to understand that father was gone, young enough to still believe father would return and make everything right. How could he explain this? How could he return home, if he ever returned, and describe Christmas in Mississippi? The abundance would sound like fantasy or betrayal. The truth would be incomprehensible. After dinner, some prisoners sang carols, traditional German hymns, voices harmonizing in the close, warm air of the Mississippi winter. Silent Night, Stille Nacht, composed by an Austrian priest, now sung by German soldiers imprisoned in America, while German bombers fell from English skies and German armies retreated across Russian steppes. The beauty of the music and the tragedy of the circumstances created a dissonance that left several men weeping openly. Von Arnim excused himself early, walked back to his bungalow, and sat in the dark for an hour before he trusted himself to write. Breaking points and breakthroughs. Not everyone adapted. Some prisoners broke under the psychological pressure of comfort. In January 1944, a young Waffen-SS lieutenant attempted suicide. He'd been a true believer, fanatically loyal to the regime, contemptuous of the Americans, certain that Germany would triumph. The camp psychiatrist later documented his reasoning. He couldn't reconcile what he was experiencing with what he'd been taught to believe. The cognitive dissonance was literally unbearable. The lieutenant survived. The camp transferred him to a psychiatric facility for treatment. The episode rippled through the camp, forcing conversations that had been avoided. Von Arnim found himself in unofficial counseling sessions with younger officers who sought him out for guidance. They knew his reputation, professional, respected, old-school military rather than Nazi ideologue. They asked questions they couldn't ask the true believers. "Herr General, were we wrong? Herr General, what do we tell ourselves about why we fought? Herr General, How do we go home after this? Von Arnim had no good answers. He offered what he could. We were soldiers. We followed orders. We did our duty as we understood it. What we're learning now doesn't erase that. It complicates it. It was inadequate. He knew it. But what else could he say? The truth, that they'd fought for a lie, that their courage had been exploited by criminals, that their sacrifices had served evil, was too corrosive. Men needed to preserve some dignity. But privately, in his journals, he was less diplomatic. We were the villains of our own story. We simply didn't know it, or refused to know it. The Americans feed us not from kindness, but from duty. They follow their own laws, even when inconvenient. That discipline, that adherence to principle even toward enemies, is what we claim to embody but never did. We spoke of honor and acted with opportunism. They speak of democracy and build systems that constrain their own power. The contrast is damnation. The news from Europe. By spring 1944, the news became impossible to ignore. The Allied bombing campaign was demolishing German cities, Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, firestorms consuming civilian populations. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The Soviets pushed west with furious momentum, and everyone knew what that meant. Von Arnim received a letter from his wife dated February 1944, arriving in May. The censors had allowed most of it through. "My dearest Hans, I write not knowing if this will reach you. The situation here deteriorates daily. We've moved to your brother's estate in Bavaria. Berlin is no longer safe. The children are thinner each month despite my best efforts. I don't tell you this to burden you, only to share the truth. We survive. Many don't. I pray you are well, wherever you are. The war news suggests it cannot continue much longer. Perhaps that is for the best. Perhaps we need to lose to stop losing more. I shouldn't write such thoughts, but I no longer care who reads this. I am tired, Hans. So tired." He read it 3 times before the implications settled. His wife, his stolid, patriotic, proper Prussian wife, was admitting defeat, welcoming it. If Antony had reached that conclusion, how many others had as well? The answer came on June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy. News reached Camp Clinton within hours via radio broadcast that the prisoners were allowed to hear. The Americans made no attempt to conceal it. 150,000 Allied soldiers landing on French beaches, overwhelming German defenses, establishing a Western front that would inevitably crush Germany between 2 advancing armies. Some prisoners maintained hope. The Atlantic Wall will hold. The Führer has reserved forces. This is expected. But most recognized it as the beginning of the end. Von Arnim certainly did. He'd studied the maps, understood logistics. Once the Allies established a beachhead with supply lines, German defeat was mathematical certainty. What surprised him was his own reaction, relief, not joy. He wasn't capable of celebrating his nation's destruction, but relief that the madness would end, that the killing would stop, that perhaps somehow Germany might survive its own ideology and build something sane from the ruins. The man in the mirror. By autumn 1944, von Arnim had been in American captivity for 18 months. He'd gained weight, grown accustomed to abundance, adapted to the rhythms of camp life. He'd read hundreds of American newspapers, dozens of books, engaged in countless conversations with fellow prisoners who were, like him, processing their transformation from warriors to witnesses. He looked at himself in the mirror one morning, a real mirror mounted in his private bathroom, and barely recognized the man looking back. Not physically, though that had changed too, but psychologically. The certainties that had organized his life for 55 years had dissolved. He'd been a German officer when that meant something clear and coherent. Now he was a German prisoner trying to understand what German would mean after Germany had burned itself to ash. The face in the mirror was fuller, healthier, less careworn than the man who'd surrendered in Tunisia. The irony was savage. Captivity had restored him physically while destroying him philosophically. the witnesses to atrocity. The true breaking point came not from abundance, but from revelation. In April 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, photographs began appearing in American newspapers. The camps. Not prisoner of war camps like Clinton or Aliceville. The other camps. Concentration camps. Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau. The Americans made no attempt to hide the images from the German prisoners. In fact, at some camps, they organized mandatory viewings, projecting newsreel footage of bulldozers pushing skeletal corpses into mass graves, of survivors who looked like ambulatory skeletons, of gas chambers disguised as showers, of crematorium ovens still containing human remains. At Camp Clinton, Colonel Marsh assembled the senior officers, von Arnim, Ravelli, a dozen others, for a private screening. No guards, no forced attendance, just an invitation that everyone understood wasn't optional. The footage ran for 20 minutes. No one spoke, no one moved. When the lights came up, Marsh stood at the front of the room. His face was granite. Gentlemen, these camps were liberated by American and British forces in the past 3 weeks. They were operated by your government, by your military, by your countrymen. Some of you will claim you didn't know. I don't particularly care whether you knew. You know now. He left them sitting in silence. Von Arnim's first reaction was denial. Not possible. Propaganda. Fabrications designed to justify Allied brutality. But the footage was too detailed, too extensive, too consistent across multiple locations. And somewhere deep in his mind, fragments of rumors he'd dismissed as exaggerations began reassembling into confirmation. Whispers about SS operations in the East. Euphemisms about resettlement and special treatment that everyone understood meant something darker, but no one examined too closely. The disappearance of Jewish colleagues and neighbors that the Wehrmacht had classified as civilian administration matters outside military jurisdiction. They had known. Not the specifics, perhaps. Not the industrial scale. But they had known enough to know they should ask no questions. The Italian general, Ravelli, broke first. He stood abruptly, walked outside, and vomited into the bushes. Others followed, not from physical revulsion, but from moral nausea, the violent rejection of complicity. Von Arnim sat frozen, his mind performing desperate calculations. He'd commanded armies. He'd never ordered atrocities. He'd been a professional soldier, not an ideologue. But he'd worn the uniform of a regime that built factories of death. He'd saluted the flag of a government that systematized genocide. His competence, his discipline, his victories, all had served the machine that produced those images. Later that evening, he wrote in his journal with a hand that shook, "I can no longer distinguish between what I didn't know and what I refused to know. The Americans feed us steaks while showing us photographs of German children, Jewish children, Romani children, Polish children, starved to death by deliberate policy. The contrast is not accidental. They are teaching us something. We are the monsters. They are the civilization. And the stakes are proof. A society that can afford such abundance toward its enemies is the antithesis of the society that required death camps to sustain itself. I cannot go back. Not to who I was. That man is dead, killed by steak and ice cream and photographs of Buchenwald. I don't know who I am now. Only what I am not." April 30th, 1945. The death of the Führer news reached Camp Clinton on May 1st. Hitler was dead. Suicide in his Berlin bunker, Germany days from unconditional surrender. The reaction among prisoners was varied and revealing. Some hardliners insisted it was Allied propaganda, that the Führer would never abandon Germany. Others received it with resignation, the final confirmation of total defeat. A few expressed relief. Von Arnim felt nothing, or rather felt everything simultaneously, the emotions canceling each other into numbness. Hitler had been the sun around which German policy had orbited for 12 years. His death should have meant something profound. Instead, it felt like the overdue completion of a process already finished. The man who'd promised to make Germany great had reduced it to rubble. The ideology that claimed superiority had proven inferiority through its own actions. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had consumed itself in 12. That evening, von Arnim walked the perimeter of the compound alone. The Mississippi spring was humid, fragrant with flowering trees, magnolias he'd learned to recognize. The camp was quiet, no celebration among the guards. They were professional enough to avoid triumphalism. No mourning among the prisoners. Most had mourned long ago for their own losses, if not for Hitler's demise. Tomorrow, Germany would surrender. The war would end. And then what? May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The Americans declared it VE Day, Victory in Europe. At Camp Clinton, they raised flags, played patriotic music, gave the guards an extra beer ration. The prisoners observed from a distance, spectators to their own defeat. Colonel Marsh made a brief speech to the assembled camp. Gentlemen, the war in Europe has ended. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. You remain prisoners of war until formal repatriation arrangements are concluded. That process will take time, months, perhaps longer. I expect you to maintain discipline and order during this period. The Geneva Convention still applies. Your rights and treatment remain unchanged. Unchanged. The word resonated differently now. They would continue eating the same food, living in the same conditions, existing in the same surreal bubble of abundance, while their homeland starved and rebuilt from ruins. Some prisoners wept. Others stood stoic. Von Arnim felt a strange detachment, as if observing the scene from outside his own body. This was the end of the world he'd been born into. The Prussian military tradition stretching back centuries, the German Empire of his childhood, the Reich of his adult service, all erased in 6 years of catastrophic miscalculation. What survived? He did. Weber did. The thousands of German prisoners scattered across American camps did. They were the remnant, the witnesses, the ones who would carry the memory of what Germany had been and what it had become. The letters that finally arrived. In June 1945, with the postal system partially restored, a flood of letters arrived from Germany. The Red Cross facilitated the exchanges, routing mail through Switzerland. Von Arnim received 7 letters from his wife, written over the previous 6 months, but delayed by the collapse of German infrastructure. The progression was devastating. November 1944. We hear the artillery now. The front is closer. We may have to leave the estate. January 1945. Berlin is gone. I mean the Berlin we knew. Your brother's family was in the bombing. Only your niece survived. March 1945. Ernst asked me today if you were dead. I told him no. You are in America. You are safe. He asked why we aren't in America too. I had no answer. April 1945. The Russians are coming. We are leaving Bavaria, moving west toward the American zones. I pray we make it. I pray you survive to meet your children again. They barely remember your face. May 1945. We are in American custody, a refugee camp near Munich. The conditions are manageable. We are alive. I write this not knowing if you still are, but hoping. The Americans ask questions about you. I tell them you were a soldier, nothing more. I don't know what else to say. Von Arnim read them in chronological order, watching his family's disintegration unfold through carefully chosen words that revealed more through omission than statement. Antonia's handwriting deteriorated across the months, steady and precise in November, shaky and cramped by May. He wrote back immediately, a long letter explaining where he was, that he was well, that he would try to arrange for their reunification. The absurdity struck him mid-sentence. His family was starving in a refugee camp in occupied Germany, while he lived in comfort in Mississippi, and the same nation responsible for both conditions was the United States of America. The Americans weren't cruel. They were simply overwhelming. Their capacity extended to both feeding their enemies lavishly and occupying their enemies' homeland comprehensively. It was abundance as weapon, generosity as conquest. Repatriation didn't happen quickly. The logistics of returning hundreds of thousands of German prisoners while simultaneously managing occupation duties, feeding displaced populations, and rebuilding infrastructure consumed the Allies' attention through 1945 and into 1946. Von Arnim remained at Camp Clinton, his status as a senior officer making him lower priority for return. The Americans wanted to debrief him thoroughly, document his command decisions, gather intelligence about German military organization. He cooperated fully. There was no point in resistance. Germany was occupied, his military career was over, and cooperation might expedite his return to his family. The camp's population fluctuated as younger prisoners were processed and sent home. By autumn 1945, Camp Clinton held perhaps 40% of its peak population. The atmosphere changed, less structured, more melancholic. The prisoners who remained were the ones with nowhere urgent to go, or whose cases required additional review, or who'd been flagged for potential war crimes investigations. Von Arnim fell into the middle category. His role commanding Army Group Africa made him a person of interest, but investigators found no evidence of war crimes under his command. He'd run a military operation, not an atrocity. The charges, when they came, would be about aggressive war itself, the broader accusation that the entire German military leadership bore collective responsibility for launching wars of conquest. The Nuremberg Revelations. The International Military Tribunal opened at Nuremberg in November 1945. The Americans provided newspapers with detailed coverage of the proceedings. Von Arnim read them obsessively, watching the systematic documentation of crimes he'd peripherally participated in through his service. The prosecution presented evidence methodically: the planning for aggressive war, the invasion of Poland, the occupation policies, the Holocaust, the slave labor, the medical experiments, the deliberate targeting of civilians. Document after document, witness after witness, photograph after photograph. Some evidence implicated the Wehrmacht directly, the Commissar Order directing execution of Soviet political officers, the Barbarossa Decree exempting German soldiers from prosecution for crimes against Soviet civilians, the cooperation between Wehrmacht units and Einsatzgruppen death squads, the forced labor of prisoners of war. Von Arnim had known about some of it, impossible not to at his rank, but the scale, the systematization, the enthusiastic cooperation of ordinary soldiers and officers, that was harder to rationalize as just following orders. He drafted a letter to his son, Ernst, who was now 12. He wanted to explain, to contextualize, to preserve some dignity for a father the boy barely remembered, but every draft sounded like excuse-making. Finally, he wrote simply, "My dear Ernst, when you are old enough to understand, you will learn things about the Germany we served. You will be ashamed of us, and you should be. I can only tell you this. I thought I was serving my country. I was wrong about what serving my country meant. I hope you will be wiser than I was. I hope you will build a Germany worth serving." He never sent it. How could he explain that his wisdom had come from captivity, from enemy generosity, from the humiliation of being fed steak while his nation starved? The message would sound insane. January 1946, the final briefing. Colonel Marsh requested a private meeting. Von Arnim arrived expecting another interrogation session, but instead found a conversation. "General, your repatriation has been approved. You'll ship out next month, pending final paperwork. I wanted to speak with you before you left." Von Arnim nodded. "I appreciate the courtesy, Colonel." Marsh studied him for a moment. "I've overseen this camp for 2.5 years, processed thousands of prisoners. You've been here longer than most, and I've watched how you've adapted. May I ask you something candidly?" "Of course. What did you learn here?" Von Arnim considered the question seriously. "That everything I believed about America was wrong. That everything I believed about Germany was wrong. That abundance matters more than courage in modern war. That ideology is a poor substitute for truth." He paused. "And that your country is either very naive or very wise to treat its enemies with such dignity." "Which do you think it is?" "Both. You're naive to believe human decency will reform your enemies. You're wise to practice it anyway, because occasionally it does. Marsh smiled slightly. Did it? Reform you, I mean. I don't know. Reform implies I became something new. I think I just stopped being something old. Whether what remains is better or worse, ask me in 10 years. They shook hands. Marsh held the grip a moment longer than necessary. Good luck, General. Germany will need men who learn to question their certainties. Germany will need men who never had certainties to question. I'm a dinosaur, Colonel. My species is extinct. February 1946. The journey home. The transport ship left from New York Harbor on February 18, 1946. Von Arnim stood on deck as the Statue of Liberty receded into the distance, that peculiar American symbol of welcome that he was now leaving behind. The irony was too perfect. The huddled masses yearned to come to America, and he, fed and fattened and broken, yearned only to leave. The Atlantic crossing took 9 days. The ship carried 3,000 German prisoners, mostly enlisted men and junior officers. The conditions were basic but adequate: bunks, mess halls serving simple food, access to deck areas for fresh air. Nothing like the luxury of Camp Clinton, but nothing like a prison ship either. Von Arnim kept to himself mostly, walking the deck in the evenings, watching the gray Atlantic roll past. Other officers occasionally approached him, seeking guidance, reassurance, some framework for understanding what they'd return to. He had nothing useful to offer. What will you do when you get back? One young captain asked. Find my family. Survive. Try to forget. Forget what? Everything, Von Arnim thought. The steak, the ice cream, the abundance, the kindness, the realization that we were the villains, that our courage was wasted on an evil cause, that the enemy we were taught to despise was more civilized than the regime we served. But he said only, forget that war ever seemed like a good idea. The ship docked at Bremerhaven on February 27th. The port was a wasteland, bombed-out warehouses, twisted cranes, sunken vessels visible at low tide. The destruction extended inland as far as Von Arnim could see. This was Germany now, ruins and refugees and the smell of defeat. Processing took hours. British occupation authorities logged prisoners, checked documentation, issued temporary papers, provided minimal supplies, and directed them toward refugee services. No welcome committees, no bands playing, no illusions. Von Arnim collected his papers in a small ration kit, bread, tinned meat, cigarettes, and stood in the ruins of Bremerhaven, trying to remember how to be German in Germany. The contrast with Mississippi was total. There, abundance. Here, devastation. There, order. Here, chaos. There, the future. Here, the past refusing to die. He had 400 kilometers to travel to reach his family's last known location near Munich. The journey would take weeks, traveling through a broken country with collapsed infrastructure and millions of displaced persons, all moving simultaneously, all searching for remnants of their former lives. The return to ruins. The journey across Germany was an education in consequences. Von Arnim traveled by whatever means available: refugee trains packed beyond capacity, military trucks occasionally willing to give lifts to former officers, long stretches on foot through landscapes that looked like visions of apocalypse. Every city bore the scars of strategic bombing. Dresden was a moonscape of rubble, Frankfurt hollowed out, Munich partially collapsed. But worse than the physical destruction was the human wreckage. Millions of displaced persons, DPs in occupation terminology, crowded roads and refugee camps. Ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe, concentration camp survivors searching for relatives, former slave laborers trying to get home, soldiers returning from captivity, families separated by years of war attempting reunification. Von Arnim moved through this chaos with a kind of detached horror. In Mississippi, he'd been insulated from consequences. Here, he was drowning in them. These were the people Germany's ambitions had ruined, Germans included. He reached the refugee camp near Munich on March 15th, having taken 16 days to travel 400 kilometers. The camp was a former Wehrmacht barracks, now administered by American military government. Thousands of people living in temporary shelters, receiving minimal rations, waiting for paperwork that would allow them to, what? Rebuild? Emigrate? Disappear? Finding his family took 6 hours of navigating bureaucracy. Finally, a young American corporal, German-American based on his accent, located the registration, von Arnim, Antony, and 2 children registered 6 months earlier. Barrack 14, Section C, the corporal said. You want me to send someone to notify them? No, I'll go myself. The barrack was a long wooden structure divided into family spaces by hanging blankets. Von Arnim walked down the center aisle, reading makeshift name signs, until he found the one marked Von Arnim in his wife's handwriting. He stood outside the blanket partition for a long moment, suddenly uncertain. What was he? A husband returning from war? A father who'd missed 3 years of his children's lives? A German officer coming home to a Germany that no longer existed? He pushed aside the blanket. Antony looked up from a small cooking stove. For a moment she didn't recognize him, too well fed, too healthy, too different from the gaunt officer who'd left for Africa. Then recognition flooded her face, and she stood so quickly she knocked over a pot. Hans. They embraced. She was skeletal in his arms, all bone and sinew. He could feel her ribs, her vertebrae, the sharp angle of her shoulder blades. The guilt was overwhelming. He'd gained weight in captivity while she'd wasted away. The children stared at him with wary curiosity. Ernst was 12 now, thin and serious looking. His daughter, Ingrid, was 9, with their mother's features and a wariness in her eyes that children shouldn't possess. Father? Ernst said tentatively. Von Arnim knelt to their level. Yes, I'm sorry I was gone so long. I'm home now. But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. This wasn't home. Home had been destroyed. They were all refugees now, inhabitants of a country that was Germany in name only, trying to imagine futures that didn't include the certainties of the past. The conversations that couldn't be honest. Over the following weeks, von Arnim attempted to reintegrate into family life within the constraints of the refugee camp. The Americans provided basic rations, bread, soup, occasional meat, vegetables when available. It was subsistence level, nothing like Camp Clinton, but more than many Germans were receiving. Antony had questions he couldn't answer honestly. What was it like? In America? Tolerable. The Americans follow Geneva Convention rules. What he didn't say: I ate steak. I had ice cream. I lived in private quarters. I gained 20 pounds while you starved. I was treated with more dignity by our enemies than our own government showed its civilians. Did they mistreat you? No, they were professional. What he didn't say: they were generous. They were abundant. They fed us better than Germany fed its soldiers. They showed us what we were fighting, and it was nothing like what we'd been told. Ernst asked the questions that cut deeper. Father, why did we lose the war? Because the Allies had more resources, more factories, more oil, more men. What he didn't say: because we were fighting for a lie. Because our ideology was bankrupt. Because you can't conquer abundance. You can only join it or be crushed by it. Were we the bad ones, Father? Von Arnim looked at his 12-year-old son, trying to formulate an answer that was honest, but not crushing. War makes everyone bad, Ernst. We did things we shouldn't have. So did they. But yes, we started it. We chose this path. And we were very wrong. It was the closest to truth he could manage. Ernst absorbed it with the seriousness of a child who'd already learned that adults don't always tell the truth, and when they do, it's usually painful. The denazification tribunals. In May 1946, von Arnim received a summons to appear before a denazification tribunal. The Allied occupation authorities were processing thousands of Germans, attempting to categorize their level of complicity with the Nazi regime. Major offenders, lesser offenders, followers, or exonerated. Von Arnim's military rank guaranteed scrutiny. He appeared before a panel of 3 judges, 2 German attorneys and 1 American military officer, to account for his service. The proceedings were bureaucratic and draining. They reviewed his military record, his command positions, his party affiliations. He'd never joined the Nazi Party, which helped. His actions in North Africa, his post-war cooperation with Allied intelligence. The prosecutor, a German lawyer who'd survived the camps, was skeptical. Herr General, you commanded armies for a regime that committed genocide. You claim you didn't know about the camps? I knew there were camps. I didn't know the details of what happened in them until the Americans showed us photographs in 1945. Convenient ignorance, wouldn't you say? Yes, very convenient, which is why I can't claim innocence. I chose not to ask questions when I suspected the answers would be uncomfortable. That makes me complicit. The admission surprised the tribunal. Most defendants claimed total ignorance or blamed superiors. Von Arnim's willingness to acknowledge moral failure while not accepting legal guilt for specific crimes created a space for a complicated verdict. After 3 days of testimony, the tribunal classified him as a follower, the second lowest category. He would face restrictions on employment and movement, but no imprisonment. His military pension was suspended indefinitely. He was prohibited from holding public office or teaching. It was, in effect, a judgment that he'd been a professional soldier who'd served an evil regime without being individually evil. He accepted it without protest. It was probably more generous than he deserved. Rebuilding from zero life in occupied Germany was a daily negotiation with scarcity. The ration system provided 1,150 calories per day for normal consumers, just above starvation level. Black markets flourished. Currency was meaningless. Cigarettes became the real money. And von Arnim's American ration kit proved more valuable than anything else he owned. He found work eventually. Manual labor, mostly. His military expertise was worthless in a country prohibited from having a military. His officers' training meant nothing to American authorities focused on reconstruction. He carried bricks, cleared rubble, dug foundations for new buildings. The work was exhausting for a man approaching 60, but it provided extra rations and a sense of purpose. The contrast with Mississippi haunted him. There he'd been idle, well-fed, intellectually engaged. Here he was exhausted, hungry, reduced to physical labor. The former was captivity. The latter was freedom. The irony was almost too perfect. Ernst watched his father's transformation with confused concern. The man who'd left in 1943 as a general, confident and commanding, had returned as someone diminished, uncertain, performing work that even Ernst recognized was beneath a former officer's dignity. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of labor, Ernst asked, "Father, do you wish you were still in America?" Von Arnim looked at his son, seeing the test in the question. The honest answer was yes, at least the captivity version of America, where food was abundant and comfort was guaranteed. But honesty would break something fragile between them. "I wish," von Arnim said carefully, "that Germany could be more like America, that we could build a country where abundance was normal, where enemies could become friends, where ideology mattered less than human dignity. But I don't wish to be in America. I need to be here, helping rebuild what we destroyed." It wasn't quite a lie. But it wasn't quite true either. He was trapped between worlds, too changed by captivity to fit back into Germany, too German to belong anywhere else. 1947, 1948, the Marshall Plan arrives. The announcement of the Marshall Plan in June 1947 created hope where there had been only despair. American economic aid, billions of dollars in reconstruction assistance, conditional on democratic reforms and economic cooperation, represented a lifeline for devastated Europe. Von Arnim heard the news with complicated emotions. The same nation that had fed him steak as a prisoner was now rebuilding Germany as an ally. The generosity was staggering, unprecedented in history. Victors typically extracted reparations from defeated enemies. America was investing in Germany's recovery. Why? The cynical answer: To counter Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe. The idealistic answer, because it was the right thing to do. Von Arnim suspected both were true, and that the dual motivation, practical and moral, was characteristically American. Ernst, now 14, was more straightforward in his enthusiasm. Father, they're going to help us. The Americans are sending food, machines, money. We won't starve anymore. Von Arnim nodded. Yes, they're generous in victory as they were in captivity. You never talk about it. America, I mean. Mother says you won't. It's complicated, Ernst. Because they treated you well? Because they treated us better than we treated ourselves. That's hard to accept. Ernst considered this with the seriousness of a teenager trying to understand adult complexities. Maybe that's why they won. Not just resources. Maybe treating people well, even enemies, is a kind of power too. Von Arnim looked at his son with surprise and recognition. The boy had articulated in one sentence what von Arnim had spent 3 years learning: dignity as weapon, generosity as strategy, decency as strength. Yes, he said quietly. Maybe that's exactly why they won. Hans-Jürgen von Arnim lived until 1962, dying at age 73 in Iserlohn, West Germany. He never fully reconciled the contradictions of his experience: professional soldier of a criminal regime, prisoner treated with dignity, witness to the collapse of his worldview. He rarely spoke publicly about his captivity. When asked by historians or journalists, he gave brief, factual accounts. The conditions were adequate. The Americans followed Geneva Convention rules. Repatriation took time. He never mentioned the steak, the ice cream, the abundance that had shattered his certainties more effectively than any interrogation. But privately, in letters to close friends and in the journals he kept until his death, he returned obsessively to those years in Mississippi. They represented the hinge point of his existence. Before he'd been certain. Afterward, he was not. The doubt was corrosive, but necessary. Certainty had led Germany to catastrophe. Doubt, uncomfortable as it was, felt like wisdom. His son Ernst became an architect, helping rebuild German cities with an aesthetic that rejected Nazi monumentalism in favor of functional humanism. He never wore a uniform. When asked about his father's career, he said simply, he served Germany. Germany was wrong. He spent the rest of his life trying to understand how he'd failed to see it. Antony never fully recovered from the war years. She remained thin, haunted, uncomfortable with prosperity, even when West Germany's economic miracle made abundance available again. She'd learned hunger too deeply to trust plenty. She died in 1958, 4 years before her husband. The von Arnim family's experience was replicated across hundreds of thousands of German prisoners. Most returned to find their country destroyed, their certainty shattered, their futures uncertain. Many struggled with the psychological whiplash of American captivity, treated well by enemies, returning to devastation created by their own regime. Some became Democrats, convinced by example that German authoritarianism had been disastrously wrong. Others retreated into nostalgia, remembering only the comradeship and discipline, forgetting the atrocities. Most, like von Arnim, lived in complicated middle spaces, neither fully reformed nor fully resistant, carrying contradictions they couldn't quite resolve. The steak as symbol. In the decades after the war, historians documented the American POW experience extensively. The statistics were remarkable. 371,683 German prisoners held in the United States between 1943 and 1946. Escape rate less than 1%. Mortality rate 0.15%, lower than the death rate in American military service. Average weight gain 17 pounds. Post-war surveys found that 75% of German POWs held in the United States described their treatment as fair or good. The experience shaped German-American relations profoundly. Many prisoners maintained correspondence with Americans they'd encountered during captivity: guards, chaplains, civilians they'd worked for on farms. Some emigrated to the United States after travel restrictions lifted. Others became advocates for German-American friendship during the Cold War, drawing on their personal experiences to argue for alliance rather than enmity. The stake, Von Arnim's steak, but also the metaphorical steak representing American abundance, became a cultural touchpoint. German memoirs from the period repeatedly emphasized the food, the cleanliness, the casual plenty that American guards took for granted, but which shattered German prisoners' propaganda-constructed worldview. One former prisoner writing in 1953 summarized it. We expected to die in American camps. Instead, we learned to live again. They fed us not because they were soft, but because they were strong enough to afford generosity. That strength, economic, moral, industrial, was what defeated us. Not their tanks, though those were impressive, their abundance. You cannot beat a nation that gives its enemies ice cream. The question that remains: did the experience of American captivity genuinely transform German prisoners, or did it simply provide comfortable conditions while time and defeat did the psychological work? Von Arnim never answered that question definitively, even to himself. But in one of his final journal entries dated March 1962, 2 months before his death, he wrote, "Ernst asked me today what I learned from the war. I gave him the usual platitudes about the tragedy of conflict. But the truth is more specific. I learned that the world I'd believed in, where hardness was virtue, where scarcity demanded ruthlessness, where strength meant domination, was not merely wrong, but obsolete. America didn't defeat Germany through superior hardness. It defeated us through superior softness. If softness means abundant resources deployed with strategic intelligence. The steak they served me in Mississippi was more devastating than any battle I lost. It represented a civilization I'd been taught to despise, but which operated on principles more sustainable than our own. We built an empire on conquest because we couldn't feed ourselves otherwise. They built abundance and shared it even with enemies because they could afford to. I spent 3 years in American captivity being treated with more dignity than my own government showed its people. That indignity, being shamed by enemy generosity, may be the most effective weapon ever deployed against totalitarianism. You cannot maintain faith in superiority when your inferiors feed you steak. If I could speak to my younger self, the officer boarding the ship for Tunisia in 1942, I would tell him, "You are about to fight for the wrong side of history. You will lose. And in losing, you will learn that some things, decency, dignity, generosity, are not weaknesses but strengths you failed to recognize. The steak you'll be served in captivity will teach you more than all your military training. Pay attention. Learn. Become something better than what we were." He died 3 weeks later. The journal was found among his papers and eventually donated to archives documenting the German POW experience in America. Coda. The echoes continue today. The sites of American POW camps have largely vanished. Camp Clinton, Mississippi was dismantled in 1946. A historical marker notes its location, but the bungalow where von Arnim ate his transformative steak no longer exists. What remains is memory, documented in thousands of memoirs, letters, and oral histories. The German prisoners who experienced American captivity carried those memories for the rest of their lives and passed them to children and grandchildren as cautionary tales. We thought we knew what America was. We were wrong. Never assume your enemies are weak because your propaganda says so. The Marshall Plan, NATO, the successful rebuilding of West Germany as a democratic ally, all built on foundations that included the POW experience. The men who'd been fed steak as prisoners became architects of German-American friendship, convinced through personal experience that cooperation was possible and beneficial, the larger lesson that abundance can be a weapon more powerful than violence, that generosity toward enemies can be strategic wisdom, that maintaining civilized standards, even in total war, can transform future relationships, remains relevant but frequently forgotten. Von Arnim's story is particular but not unique. Hundreds of thousands of German prisoners had similar experiences, varying in details but consistent in themes: the shock of plenty, the collapse of propaganda certainties, the uncomfortable realization that the enemy was more civilized than expected, the guilt of being treated well while countrymen suffered. The steak that shocked Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim on May 17, 1943, was just dinner. but it represented the industrial capacity, economic sophistication, and moral confidence of a civilization that could afford to treat enemies like humans. That representation, made concrete in meat, butter, ice cream, and coffee, did something no battlefield victory could. It convinced the defeated that their defeat was deserved, not because they were evil, though their regime was, but because they'd chosen hardness over abundance, ideology over pragmatism, conquest over cooperation. And in doing so, they'd lost not just the war, but the future. The stake was a message delivered on porcelain instead of parchment. This is what you were fighting. This is what you could never defeat. This is why your courage and discipline and sacrifice meant nothing in the end. And the message was received, digested, and internalized by hundreds of thousands of prisoners who returned home carrying knowledge more subversive than any political propaganda. America wasn't the enemy Germany had imagined. It was something far more dangerous, a working alternative to everything the Third Reich represented. That knowledge, planted in Mississippi and Alabama and Texas and dozens of other camps scattered across an abundant nation, grew into the soil of post-war Germany. Not all prisoners changed, not all learned, but enough did to matter. The stake had done its work.